Good morning, everyone. Let's start it. Everybody ready? Okay. Good morning from UK and good afternoon in Australia, right, Trent? And I am Stephen Cabral. I'm chairing this panel, which is developing language education policy in a global age, the case of Timor-Leste. And I would like to introduce after me, Marlene will introduce the main themes of the panel, and then followed by Alan Carneiro in Sao Paulo, then Hildegarda da Costa Cabral here in the UK, and the last but not least will be St. Newman in Australia. So now I pass you on to Marlene to present it.
Okay. Oh. Okay. Sorry? Can you speak a bit louder? Where? Where? On this one? Oh, yes. Okay, right. So, thanks for joining us at all the strange hours. A really big thank you to the conference organizers for enabling us to present our work in this panel. The full versions of all the papers will be published next year in a special issue of the journal Language Policy. And a fourth paper on adult literacy by our colleagues in Tilburg University will also be part of that special issue. Those colleagues are Daniel Bohn, Edgar da Conceição Savio, Chacron, and Jean Curvas. So today, my task is to introduce the main themes of the panel, as Stefan said, and to present and to place the research that's going to be presented today by our colleagues in a wider context. Okay, so a brief outline of our presentation. I will begin with a sketch of the research context, and specifically the development of a critical ethnographic approach to language policy processes. Then I'll go on to delineate the global conditions for the development of language and education policy in Timor-Leste. After this, I will turn to the local sociolinguistic conditions in which Timor-Leste is developing its language and education policy. And here, the focus will be on local language practices and ideologies. And then in the last part, I will indicate what we can learn by looking both globally and locally. And I will point to the implications for future research on language policy in relation to TETUM. Okay, the research context. The early research on language policy from the 1960s to the 1990s was called language planning. This was conceptualized as a practical objective science based on language surveys and quantitative methods. Since the 1990s, there have been two major epistemological shifts in the field, which have particular relevance to the three presentations in this panel. Firstly, we saw the development of a critical historical approach. This built on wider developments within the social sciences, critical theory and post-structuralism, for example. This approach combined document analysis with interviews and focused on policy processes on a national and global scale. Attention was paid also to the role of language ideologies in shaping language policy processes. Then secondly, we saw a shift towards what's now called a critical ethnographic approach, focusing on the local scale of classrooms and on the links between practices in classrooms and national policy processes. A good deal of this research was conducted in Global South contexts like Timor-Leste. The research presented in this panel falls into this second tradition. I turn now to the global conditions in which Timor-Leste is developing its language in education policy. There are two global processes of relevance to this panel. There are, of course, others. Firstly, in the multipolar world of the late 20th century and early 21st century, we have seen the development of new political alliances, new economic ties, and cultural links between nation states where Portuguese is an official language. Largely due to the rise of Brazil in the late 20th century. So the CPLP, the Comunidade dos Países da Língua Portuguesa, was created in 1996. And since then, we've seen a circulation of new globalized discourses about Portuguese. Secondly, we've seen the internationalization of higher education, and at the same time, the diversification of postgraduate study pathways for Timorese aiming for a career in academia. In 1996, the goals of the CPLP were defined as follows: the promotion, defense, enrichment, and dissemination of the Portuguese language as a vehicle of culture, education, information, and access to scientific knowledge and technology. Now, in the 21st century, there's clearly been considerable movement towards these goals. For example, there's been a development of expertise in the teaching of Portuguese as an additional language, PLA, as it's known in Brazil, and a lot of courses for teachers, and also a development of expertise in Portuguese medium education. There's also been commodification and export of this expertise from Brazil and Portugal, for example, through bilateral cooperation programs. And the paper by Alan Carneiro gives us an insight into the workings of one of these programs in Timor-Leste. In addition, there's been a global expansion in private Portuguese medium education. A number of researchers have documented this new positioning of Portuguese in the globalized market for languages, but I don't have time to elaborate on that here. The significance of these developments for state education in Timor-Leste are threefold. Portuguese is becoming a key resource for social mobility and is seen as such around the world. There's also been a growth in Portuguese-only private education and investment in this type of education by elite social actors. And these developments pose a particular challenge for the original inclusive vision behind the original policy commitment to education through the medium of both Portuguese and Tetum. I turn now to the second global condition that has implications for language and education policy in Timor-Leste, that of the internationalization of higher education, which is intensifying, and the diversifying pathways followed by Timorese academics into this higher education market. During the Indonesian occupation, Indonesia was the main destination for those embarking on postgraduate studies, and it is still the main destination due to the lower costs involved. Following independence, a small number of lecturers did receive grants for study in Portugal, so they are more familiar with the Portuguese academic scene. The pathways into postgraduate studies are now diversifying, students going to Philippines, Thailand, and so on, Australia, Europe. So as a result, Timorese university lecturers have increasingly diverse educational biographies and language repertoires, and diverse views of instruction at higher education level, as we will hear from Trent Newman soon. Okay, I turn now to the study of local conditions for language policy making. Researchers working in the field of language policy are now unpacking the notion of policy implementation and revealing its complexity. David Cassels-Johnson, for example, has argued that language policy making is a set of processes of policy creation, interpretation, and appropriation. Interpretation refers to the ways in which local practitioners make sense of policies created on a national scale, and appropriation refers to the actual agentive practices of practitioners. They may comply with language policy prescriptions, or they may adapt, recast, or even overlook them so as to meet their students' needs and deal with local diversities. All three of the papers in this panel and the work of our colleagues in Tilburg start from this description and analysis of these processes of interpretation and appropriation in different settings, in Timor-Leste, in teacher education, in primary schools and university settings, and adult literacy. The links between these local situated processes and national and global policy processes and discourses are then investigated. Take, for example, primary education in Timor-Leste. The current language policy allows for the use of Tetum and Portuguese, but there is lack of guidance as to how Tetum and Portuguese should actually be used in day-to-day classroom life. Moreover, there are differing views and interpretations among policymakers regarding the roles of Tetum and Portuguese in primary education, as we see in the work of Ildegrada da Costa Cabral. Most of the teaching materials and textbooks are in Portuguese as well. So despite this pedagogic challenge, there's ample evidence, again from the work of Ildegrada da Costa Cabral and also Marie Quinn, that teachers show considerable commitment to making the current language policy work in local classrooms. Moreover, Timorese teachers are forging different ways of mediating Portuguese teaching materials on a day-by-day basis in their classrooms, talking in Tetum, for example, around textbooks in Portuguese, writing in one way and speaking in another, and so on, and providing access to teaching materials in highly skillful ways. The situation in higher education in Timor-Leste is rather different, as we see from the situation from the work of Newman 2019. Portuguese is the official medium of instruction at this level, but within this sector, there is the most significant divergence from national language and education policy. As Trent Newman has shown in his 2009 study, there's a strong trend towards the use of Tetum for spoken communication across vocational fields and institutions. Moreover, Tetum is blended and mixed with other language resources, quite often Indonesian, and other modes of communication also, PowerPoint slides, whiteboards, and so on. And Tetum is blended with other resources in highly varied ways. Yet at the same time, some university lecturers tend to express quite negative views about the use of Tetum as a means of building academic knowledge in a university setting. Newman will tell us more about the discourses and language practices of the academics participating in his study in his presentation for the panel. So, as researchers concerned with language policy processes in Timor-Leste, what do we learn by looking both globally and locally? By combining close description and analysis of language practices in local classrooms with analysis of wider policy processes and global conditions. Well, on a global scale, we can see there's ample support for the reintroduction of Portuguese in Timor-Leste, and that the language is increasingly associated with social mobility. Also, on a global scale, the diversification of pathways into academia for university lecturers poses new challenges for language policy. They are becoming increasingly, university lecturers are becoming increasingly acquainted with different bodies of knowledge and acquiring expertise in knowledge building in particular languages, Indonesian, Portuguese, English, and in particular registers and genres of those languages. On a local scale, TETM has become a key resource for getting things done educationally, from primary schools to universities. It is a significant resource for meaning making and for building classroom relationships and so on. Yet, as we can see from the work of Da Costa, Cabral and Newman, TETM is talked about in ambivalent and rather negative terms by those who occupy prestigious positions in educational circles, for example, policymakers and university lecturers. I have signs from Stefan that I need to finish soon, so I've got 2 more slides. So in keeping with the critical ethnographic tradition of research presented in this panel, we need to adopt a view of language as a social and cultural practice. And we need to shift our attention from languages as objects, as autonomous systems, to speakers and their practices. We need to document what educational practitioners actually do in classrooms with the language resources available to them. It's also necessary to challenge some of the thinking about TETM. For example, the idea that TETM is at a preliminary stage of development and that it can only serve alongside Portuguese as a pedagogic aid. Secondly, we need to challenge the idea that TETM is somehow lacking in full languageness. Years ago, this was said by the Dutch about Indonesian. This is a language ideology which is rooted in colonialism. If we focus on speakers of TETM, we can see that in different sectors of education, they are contributing to the development of new ways of using and extending TETM, forging new technology, forging new terminology, new registers, and new genres. These practices could be understood as small, significant local acts of linguistic citizenship, following the work of Chris Stroud. Okay, well, these are the themes that underpin our panel. I've covered a lot of ground rather fast. Perhaps some of the issues that I've raised can be picked up in the discussion later on. In the meantime, here are some of the references we're drawing on. I'll hand over to Stefan now. Normally it's this one. No, I just ask. Okay, just a second.
We need our advisor here. How to exit the PowerPoint? We are not very good at it. So, just a few minutes. Okay. Yes, now Alan's coming in now. Yeah, it's okay now. Yeah. Okay. Now, perhaps I should say that after any questions or comments will be done after all 3 presentations. Now, and good morning, bon dia, Alan. Now I'm going to hand to you, Alan.
Conseguem me ouvir agora?
Sim, sim.
Ok.
Okay.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, Trent. Bom dia aos colegas brasileiros que acordaram também de madrugada. So first of all, I would like to say thanks to Marilyn and Stefan for organizing this panel. We are finally finishing up this special issue that we hope that will be a contribution to the studies about language policy in Timor-Leste, and will be published in the Journal of Language Policy next year. So we are all excited with this possibility. So I would like to to say that I'm very happy to see you all, Hildegrada, Daniele, and Trent, and Marilyn and Stefan that will be on this special issue. And it's also nice to see you after so many years. So I intend here to talk about this paper in which I'm focusing on the history of the Brazilian and the Portuguese cooperation. So the main reason why I wrote that is because I felt that there was this was a topic that was lacking in the bibliography in English language in relation to the processes of implementation of educational policy in Timor-Leste. So this is why also I should say to my colleagues from Timor, this is why I'm presenting it in English. So it would be expected from me that as a Brazilian I would be speaking in Portuguese, and probably that I would be also publishing this article in Portuguese. But this is a main reason. So it's sharing some perspectives about what we have been doing together. So me and other Brazilian teachers, and also Portuguese teachers and Timorese teachers who are working with Portuguese language. So it's showing up our perceptions about these processes. So I'm also a subject of this research. So I'm talking here as a former cooperation teacher and as someone who got engaged with this process. So it's my view from an insider perspective. So then here, so these are a few overarching issues that I had when I was writing this article. So I had sometimes the impression that it was necessary to build a more nuanced account of this language policy processes. So sometimes when I was reading things that were published in English, I would feel that there was something lacking in these discussions. And sometimes I think that we would have, like, for example, a national narrative about the focus in the national narrative of the development of this language policies, or sometimes a focus on the cooperation processes, but we didn't have like an account that would try to show up how these things were built together. So this is what I try to do in this paper, and more specifically in relation to the implementation of Portuguese language, the reintroduction of Portuguese language. So a reason for that, so maybe why sometimes the Portuguese cooperation, the Brazilian cooperation didn't have the visibility. So this is a quotation of there is in the article about from the Brazilian representative of cooperation in Timor in one of the international meetings of development partners. And he says, despite the distance, Brazil and Timor-Leste are part of a fraternity based on 500 years of common heritage. The poet would say that for us, former colonies, the Portuguese language is like a trophy that we won in a battle that we lost. A trophy won through suffering that over time became ours and was transformed into an instrument of our own freedom. So he's making indirect quotation of Xanana Guzmão here, of a poem of Xanana Guzmão, and is talking about this fraternity and about the solidarity that is present a lot in the discourses of people who went to Timor to work with cooperation from Portugal and from Brazil. So, and then maybe this would be a way to see why sometimes the work of this cooperation was not so visible in the implementation of language policies. But I think there are more issues in relation to that. It will be too simplistic to just view by this gaze what happened there. So what I would say is that despite of this close alignment there have been different views between the Portuguese, the Brazilian, and the Timorese in the development of all these areas of language and education policies, and differences in conception of language, language teaching, teacher training, and strategies for dealing with the local language diversity. So, and why to study that is important? Because without understanding the cooperation between Timor-Leste, Brazil, and Portugal, it's difficult to understand how the educational system of Timor-Leste was built along this year. So if you would like to understand what teachers are doing in their classrooms, how they are using their textbooks, it's important to have a look at the cooperation to know from where sometimes they learned specific ways of dealing with materials, with textbooks, from where comes some language ideologies that they have, their views about teaching, what is to be a teacher. And this is, there are a lot of differences between also the systems of Portugal and of Brazil, and the way language curriculums are organized, language teaching practices are organized, in textbooks. So it's interesting to see how these things develop in a different way in Timor. So this was the main topic, in a sense, of my thesis. I developed this more in my thesis, and here, so I'm just bringing some excerpts. And I know that I cannot talk so much because we don't have so much time, but basically what I had for this presentation was two main objectives. One was to present a brief analytic account of the trajectory of the Portuguese and the Brazilian cooperation initiatives in Timor-Leste in the specific field of teacher training. And for this, I draw on my field work, on interviews and participant observation, and on secondary sources. So I make a summary of what was written and how this cooperation projects developed along the years. And my second aim is to present the positioning of a few teachers that were involved in a specific project. So I won't talk a lot about this. So this would be something that I should be writing, that is about this specific project of cooperation of Instituto Camões with the National University of Timor-Leste. That was the course for training teachers of Portuguese language. So it's a cooperation project that has a very interesting history of construction and of adaptations of the curriculum along the years to make it fit the Timorese context. So bring a small data that brings a bit of its history, but it's very interesting to observe how this course got adapted to the Timorese context. It was planned initially as a course for training teachers like the ones from Portugal, and then it became a very Timorese course for training Portuguese language teachers. So in terms of my theoretical concern, something that is really important for me is time and research and time, in a sense. So I'm building up this idea here because I see the process of building language policies as a sequence of interaction. So if you think about Bakhtin and about language chains that happens along the time, so things are all the time happening and changing as you have a new interaction, a new moment of rethinking about the past, and this will be also changing the future. So this was the way that I was looking for my data. And what I was looking specifically is how political hegemony was constructed along the time. So how differences were mediated and negotiated. And the main data that I worked with, despite of producing different data, was interviews. So I was interested in the ways that the specific chronotopes were brought in the interactions, and they would point out to specific moments in the past, but also rebuild an interpretation from the past, and also point out for the future. So if we look at each interaction, they are along a chain of these courses. So I was interested how language policies is constructed along these chains, and more specifically about how hegemony is constructed along that. So in terms of methodology, it was inspired by the ethnographic stream of research and language policy, but I did it in my own way, in a sense, because I was trying to answer specific questions. So me and Ildegrada, we did field work at the same time, and we used to talk together when we were in Dili, Timor-Leste, and sometimes Ildegrada was very focused on her spaces of work, and I was usually going to different places and doing different things, and sometimes we had like very different strategies of doing research, because we are like trying to understand different processes. We are working at the same time, but trying to do different processes. So each ethnography also has its own characteristics. And so I produced a lot of that data, but at the end, I was very interested in interviews that I did with the narratives of the teachers, because we became very intimate. So most of part of my more interesting, the most interesting data that I produced was in the end of my period of field work. I spent 6 months there in 2012. And most part of the data I produced in the last month, because I was very close to the teachers that I was working with or interviewing. So we did a lot of things together, and this made this data very rich. So because we're very intimate, so there was this meta-pragmatic level of intimacy that helped me to produce some very interesting data in these interviews. This is why I chose them. So in terms of theoretical framework, I went more to the linguistic anthropology perspective. So I worked with the concept of stance and positioning from Jaffe, meta-pragmatic and language ideologies to analyze this stance, and looking at the dynamics of political economy, and more specifically to this issue of how hegemony is constructed. There is a topic in the field of language policy, but we have very few texts that approach it from a social interactional perspective. So basically, we have 2 texts, one from Monica Heller and one from Bloomer, and this will be the third. So I think this is also a very important contribution of this paper. So I have to go to the data soon. So in relation to the process of reviewing the construction of the policies of both cooperation projects, what is very important to highlight is the fact that just after the independence, Timor didn't have teachers at all. So 8% of the teachers of post-primary education left the country, as most part of them were Indonesian, and 20% of the primary education teachers left the country. So there was a huge difficulty about how to train teachers to be in the schools. And so this was very tense for the Timorese, and they came to Brazil, they went to Portugal to look for help to rebuild the educational system. So the first steps for that, and then it was like what Portugal and Brazil did in Timor, they didn't do it in any other place. So it was by attempts and doing mistakes, as most part of the corporations did. So it was not very different, because it was like a very specific situation. So in the beginning, they sent like teachers to the schools. So, and then this didn't work, obviously, because they could put just one Portuguese language teacher in each school to train, to teach the students and to train the teachers. So this was not enough. Then in the second moment, there was this very important project that was Bacharelato, that was constructed jointly between Portuguese and Brazilian cooperation agencies. It was built together, but they worked independently, so they were not working properly together. But this was a main course for training teachers in higher education to be teachers in the schools. And this project lasts from 2004 to 2011. And from 2011 to 2014, the Brazilian cooperation started to leave the country. So you had some years that you didn't have teachers going to Timor-Leste, and 2014 was actually the last year of the Brazilian cooperation. And during this period, there was also a change in the Portuguese cooperation, because the Timorese started to fund part of the projects. It was not anymore just with funding from Portugal, but also with Timorese funds. And then you had also, Marilyn mentions it, that was the project of reference schools that would be special schools, one in each district, that would be model schools where you would have also the training of the teachers. And during this time, sorry.
5 minutes, Alan.
Okay, thank you, Esteban. So in 2009 and 2011, there was also a new curriculum being designed, and the training of the teachers was also focused on training them for this new curriculum. And then the Timorese government, Ministry of Education, developed also partnerships with Portugal and Portuguese universities to design these new courses for training teachers. So, and also there was a new generation of teacher trainers that were coming from Brazil and from Portugal after doing the masters, and they started also to conduct the teacher training. This happened 2012, 2013. This was at the time that I was there. So each time more and more, you have a process of more autonomy in the management of the policies in Timor-Leste. So, and sometimes when I would see people evaluating these policies, there were always like problems raised by everybody, and people accusing the faults of each other. So the Timorese people from the Ministry of Education blaming the Portuguese and the Brazilian for the problems, the Brazilian and the Portuguese blaming the Timorese. But what we can see is that they were all working together and trying to find ways to accommodate their differences and manage these policies, building consent. So this is an important issue that would move forward these policies. So this was a main thing during this time. So in relation to the trajectory of the language teacher, so that were my interviews, I just show here quickly some data. So this was in relation to, it was a conversation with a colleague from the university, a Portuguese colleague. She was talking about the curriculum of the course for training teachers at university. And as the curriculum was just imported from Portugal, there were a lot of courses that would not make any sense. And then she gives this example: design and evaluation of educational project, probably like this, something that doesn't exist in Timor, exists only in Portugal. And then in another moment she says, now finally I think that we have a curriculum adapted to the local context. I should highlight mainly because of the teaching of Tetum and the courses of contrastive linguistics to help the students to understand better how language works, but there was also a social stage that finally ended up. This was a problem with the curriculum of the university, but it was something obligatory decided by the university. So what I analyze here from this data, so the tensions around this curriculum, they were managed along the years, and there was a main language ideology in the curriculum that was focused on training teachers for teaching Portuguese language. But what actually happened in Timor is that this course had to change its profile and became a very multilingual course. So the students became trained for working with Portuguese and working with Tetum, and also for working with the local languages, because when they would do, for example, the final works of the courses, they would usually work with translation in local languages, or research about local literature, oral literature. So there was this process of adapting the curriculum to the local needs and transforming it in a very Timorese kind of course with like courses about Timorese literature, Timorese oral literature, these courses of contrastive Teton. So another one was talking with a Brazilian Portuguese teacher, and then she talks about the moment of the cooperation, the problems with the cooperation between the cooperation agencies. And then she brings that at some point there was a war for power here in the fifth line. So between the cooperation, and the coordinator of the Portuguese cooperation unofficially would not let us, the Brazilian teachers, to work in some of the activities for training teachers, because they would not speak properly Portuguese, so they could not teach Portuguese because they are Brazilians. So they would have to work with chemistry, physics, geography, history. So this was a moment of tension. And when she was analyzing that, the Portuguese and the Brazilian cooperation was working together, because they, and I asked, do you think that this relationship between the cooperations are better? Yes, because I think that the Brazilian cooperation, the Portuguese cooperation lost their power in this government. So this creates a new situation that unifies them. So she makes this analysis. So by the end, so this is a Timorese teacher, and she talks about how she sees her work, and then she says, for me, it's a new struggle, a challenge. Everybody has challenges. Is this, our life is also a challenge. For me, it's exactly a challenge. It's not exactly a challenge, but a struggle. It's a new struggle. I feel a lot of pity because the students are not guilty. So she was talking mainly about the students who studied in Indonesian, and then they were at university having to cope with Portuguese and having lots of difficulty to follow the courses. So she was commenting on that. And then she says that the teachers should not have led the students to pass in the exams, but she knows also, she considers also that the teachers didn't have like the capacity or the training to be evaluating this in the best way. So, and she says they are also there teaching to survive. And this happened a lot with people who didn't have like the proper qualifications to become teachers, but they became teachers because there were no teachers to be in the school. So they took the job and they were trying to do something. So she's considering these issues, and she puts like to be a Portuguese language teacher as a continuation of her struggle. She was like very involved in the struggle for independence. So she brings and she sees her work as a continuation of that. So what I see in that, so, and this is I try to discuss in the end of the article, is that all these stances points out for the resources, through the resources of scaling, so how a local knowledge about the implementations of the policies happens at different times. And they also point out for how they were reshaped and also to possible redesigns of them. And so we can see also that the policies are the effect of power struggles among different social actors. And despite of the constraints, there are always spaces to construct agents, to accommodate tensions, and to construct alternative projects. So I think that the main contribution of this article is like to show up how the process of reintroduction of Portuguese language is a product of a complex and layered ideological process of disputes for hegemony. So this was my main aim in writing that. So thanks, and sorry for taking so long, and let's keep moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Alan. I think you just make on time, because I gave you 5 extra time because we will start 5 minutes later. So thank you, and we'll be, I'm sure there will be more questions around, so for you to answer, I think. Now, my next speaker is Hildegarda da Costa Cabral. Are you online, Hilde?
Yes, I am.
Okay, yeah. So now it's your turn now.
Yes, can I? Okay. Okay, let's go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Hildegarda, and the title of my paper for this special issue is From Discourses About Language and Education Policy, Language Practices in the Classroom, a Linguistic Ethnographic Study of a Multiscalar Nature in Timor-Leste. So my paper focuses on language and education policy in Timor-Leste, on the ways in which this policy is being translated into classroom practice, and on the ways in which teachers and policymakers understand and talk about it. So this paper makes the case for conducting ethnographic research of a multi-layered nature that links language policy processes and ideology of language with everyday practices on the ground in local schools and classrooms. So this paper draws on linguistic ethnographic research that I carried out in Dili as part of my PhD project. So I was in Dili with Alan in 2012. And it included classroom observations, field notes, video or recording of classroom interactions, and semi-structured interviews with teachers, head teachers, policymakers, and the data analysis presented today, will center on two research participants. You can see here teacher Lucia and then Mr. Omar. So all these names are pseudonyms. Okay, so it's as to protect the participants' identity. But before I move on to talk about these two research participants, I would like to mention first the notions that will help me discuss the data that I brought to this presentation, which are language ideologies and code switching. So as Blackwood says, language ideologies are the values, practices, and beliefs associated with language used by speakers and the discourse that constructs values and beliefs at state, institutional, national, and global levels. And I will show how language ideologies provide us as researchers with a way of making connections between the views about language, policy articulated by different social actors, positioned on different scales on language practices on the ground in local classrooms. Code switching, according to Grosjean, it has been described as alternate use of two or more languages in the same utterance. And in this paper, we will refer to the use of code switching between Portuguese and Tetum. I will not put together an inventory of the functions of and meanings of code switching of the classrooms that I observed. Instead, I will focus on the teachers and learners' use of code switching as a contextualization cue. So as Gamper says, contextualization cues can index particular values, ideologies, identities, relationships, or shared worlds of experience, adding further layers of meaning to what is already being said. So I turn now to my two research participants. So you can see, so the data analysis that I'll present next in a couple of slides centered on the semi-structured interview with a senior member of the Ministry of Education, Mr. Mota, as I mentioned earlier on, and teacher Lucia, who is a Year 6 classroom teacher. So I will show data about a talk that she had with her pupils around the Portuguese text. Starting with Mr. Mota. So Mr. Mota attended the Portuguese medium school until Year 6. After the Indonesian invasion, the rest of his schooling was in Indonesian. He completed a first degree in English language teaching and economics by a distance learning program run by an Indonesian university. After that, he worked as a teacher of English and economics in a school in Dili and then became the head of the school. At a later stage, he was promoted to a post at the Ministry of Education as head of an administrative section, and he worked at the ministry until 1999. He speaks 5 languages, as you can see, Maksai, Tetu, Indonesian, and English. And in 2012, at the time of the interview, he held a senior position at the Ministry of Education. So Mr. Mota was asked to comment on a statement written in Portuguese, taken from the Decree Law of Basic Education System. I'll read it in English, in Português. As línguas do ensino do sistema educativo timorense são o teto e o português. You can see the translation there. And then, so I basically asked Mr. Mota to comment, to say if he agreed with this statement and make any further comment about it. He replied in Tetu, but I present here only my translation in English of what he said. So in his comments in the quotation, Mr. Mota supported, of course, the official language in education policy, and that the 2 languages have the same status. So he says Portuguese and Tetu are the same. Teachers should not be forced to use only Tetu, at least at that particular time of history. We're talking about 2012. He made case for the use of Portuguese as the main language and Tetu as an auxiliary language to clarify the meaning of text in Portuguese. So you can see here where he says sometimes teachers can read with their pupils in Portuguese to explain to them as we're doing now. We read in Portuguese and I explain in Tetu. This can also happen in the classroom. That's what we were doing in our interview. The codes from the policy document were written in Portuguese, and he would respond, the rest of the interview carried on in Tetu. That's why he made this comparison here. Yet, Mr. Mota imagined a future scenario where classes would be conducted monolingually in Portuguese. As he said in the last 2 lines of his code, let it go slowly, very slowly, until it gets to the time where the teacher in the classroom, where the teacher is in the classroom with Portuguese only. But this time will come. I'll turn now to my second research participant, Teacher Lucia. Teacher Lucia was teaching a subject called Tutumai, which was translated into environmental studies. She had received her education through the medium of Portuguese. She's also a multilingual speaker, as Mr. Mota. She was a teacher during the Indonesian occupation, and she continued to teaching after independence. During the Indonesian occupation, she had 2 roles within the resistance: to supply food to the forces near the border with West Timor and to teach children and adults. And at the time of my fieldwork in 2012, she had a heavy daily schedule since she was teaching in 2 schools. So in the afternoon, she was teaching in the Catholic school where I conducted my study. And in the morning, she was in another school teaching mathematics. Very, very sad. So about the school. So the school was created in the last years of Indonesian occupation as part of a small local neighborhood project with 2-fold goals: to teach Portuguese and to attend the needs of families by providing an education for the children. So the year 6 classes that Teacher Lucia was teaching had 46 pupils. They were between 12 and 18 years old. And the textbooks that they used in the classroom were produced in Portugal and were written in Portuguese. However, there were not enough textbooks for everybody. Teacher Lucia followed the particular pedagogical practices that I summarize here. She followed the standard script in teaching from the textbook in Portuguese. So this consisted of using the blackboard, so a lot, and teacher student talk around a particular text from the textbook. So the lessons that I observed involved the following activities, teaching learning activities. A summary of the lesson content was written on the textbook, was the first thing that they would do. And then the relevant text in the Portuguese from the book, from the textbook, was then written on the blackboard, since there were some students who did not have a copy of the textbook. And then teacher Lucia focused on language and content of different parts of the text, mostly by asking questions to the students. The question and answer routines were led by the teacher, and the students responded to questions either individually or in chorus. She seldom selected an individual student to provide a response.
5 minutes, Tilde.
Okay, thank you. Now, before I get to the classroom transcript, I need to give you some context of the lesson. So the lesson was about local means of transportation in Timor-Leste. So you can see here the text written in Portuguese and then a translation. And teacher Lucy and her students were talking about this text in Portuguese. The Lucy will focus mostly in this first sentence. Os transportes são um fator importante na movimentação. And teacher Lucy and this text was written on the blackboard, and we were talking about this text. In the paper that I'll publish, that will be published in this special issue, I analyzed 3 classroom extracts, but today in this presentation I'll show you just part of one extract. So here is the classroom transcript, and so you can see on this side, on the left-hand side of this screen, you see the original language used. So in bold is Teto, and then the rest is in Portuguese. Not in bold is in Portuguese. And then TL stands for teacher Lucia, and PP pupils, pupil or pupil. Okay. This extract shows how teacher Lucia was focusing on language, on the meaning of this sentence, os transportes são um fator importante, and we see that the students were having difficulty understanding its meaning. We can see 4 things happening in this interaction. So firstly, on 2 occasions, teacher Lucia opened up the possibility of using Teto by asking for translation of particular terms. So we have here lines 4 to 1 in Teto and 4 to 3. And then again 4, 3, 5 in Teto. That's what she asked. So, and secondly, she also elicited responses from the students by employing prompts of the complete my utterance type. So here in line 4 to 9, ne fator bot li, and then the pupils would complete bot liu. She did this in Teto in different teacher initiation turns with this relatively short interactional sequence. So this clearly enabled the students to participate, either individual or in chorus. So they knew that every time the teacher wouldn't complete an utterance, the pupils, they would have to complete it. Thirdly, in lines 436 to 445, we see the repetition of the term movimento and choral rehearsal of this key term in Teto. And fourthly, every now and then, teacher Lucy incorporated elements of the Portuguese sentence on the board in the teacher initiations so that the students start to hear what they sound like. So you have here in line 4 to 2 and 4 to 3, and then 4 to 8 as well. So what we see in this extract in terms of bilingual practices is that teacher Lucia mediated the written text for her students by code switching, by drawing on Portuguese and Teto. In elaborating on the text in Teto, she also made bridges between the language of the and a language familiar to students growing up in Dili. Her frequent naming of Tetu, as she asked for translations in Tetu, made it clear that she consented to its use as a language of teaching and learning. So in summary, the language ideologies indicated from Mr. Motta's interview code and Teacher Lucia's classroom practices are as follows. So Mr. Motta believed on the value of Portuguese and Tetu. He made a case for working bilingually, being Portuguese the main language of teaching and learning, and Tetu being used as an auxiliary language. He seemed to be keenly aware of the lived experiences of teachers and their students in Timorese primary classrooms. Yet he anticipated an era when there could be monolingual teaching in which Portuguese would be the only medium of instruction. Teacher Lucia also supported language and education policy that calls for the use of both Portuguese and Tetu in the classroom. As I tried to illustrate in the classroom, code switching between Tetu and Portuguese was the main pedagogical strategy. However, her use of the textbook in Portuguese and her use of Tetu as an auxiliary language, as she mediated the textbook in Portuguese, conveyed the idea that Portuguese was the legitimate language of the curriculum and the main target language. So I would like to consider the following points as my final remarks. First one, the implementation of the language education policy in primary schools in Timor has been a challenging process since 1999. Second one, both Portuguese and Tetu are valuable for social mobility in Timor-Leste. Third one, the current investment in the initial training of Portuguese language teachers in Timor-Leste should cover not only how to teach in Portuguese, but also how to develop bilingual educational pedagogies, including the use of Tetu and or other languages that are familiar to the teachers and students. Fourth and last, I argue for the acceptance of the pedagogical use of code switching as a communicative strategy in classrooms and acknowledgement of its value, instead of seen as a reflection of lack of language abilities on the part of teachers. And then I leave you with my references, and thank you. Obrigada por me ouvirem. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Hilde. And so I'm sorry for the sound because we are, I think, two computers in the same room, so the sound is
Same house.
same house, so the sound is a bit something. But anyway, thank you. And now next is Trent. Are you online now, Trent?
I am,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, now it's up to you.
Okay, let me just see that I can see you. Otherwise, I feel like I'm talking to myself. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Great. All right, so I'm going to talk about Tetun Akademiku, so how Tetun is being intellectualized, particularly by lecturers at universities in the tertiary sector in East Timor. And I just want to clarify that I think in the program, my title came across as University Lecturer's Role in the intellectualization of Tetun, but they have multiple roles, so that's definitely plural. And you can see one of them already at the top there. That's an image of a photo of feedback on some students' work. This is in a petroleum engineering degree, and they're doing a tugas, which some of you may know is an Indonesian word for task, but it's an essay. So he's not, this lecturer isn't corrected tugas because it's Indonesian. They've corrected tugas because it's not a tugas, it's not a task, it's an essay. And so you can see the comment there, precisa aprender tan konabauinsa hakerek essay. You need to learn more about how to write an essay. written in Tetun as feedback. And on the left, well, it's my left, I assume it's yours as well, hadiah cover, so you fix the cover. And so you can see even in the feedback being given, there's mixing going on. Noticeably no Portuguese, though, no Portuguese loans yet, but definite presence of English and Indonesian in the Tetun. So before I jump too much more into my own work, I want to acknowledge that we are participating, all of us, in the intellectualization of Tetun. The conference, credit to them, the TLSA Portugal organizers, thank you, by the way, for enabling this, and thank you also to Marilyn and Esteban for making this panel happen. But it's excellent, I have to point out, that this intellectualization of Tetun is happening as it is being used in this conference. Certainly it is one of the 3 languages in which the conference information has appeared on the website, as you can see here, and as you will all have noted, and it is appearing in some titles, but to my knowledge, not one presentation in this conference, at least, including mine, is entirely in Tetun. So we are also participating in the reinforcement of the more established academic languages of English and Portuguese to, you could say, shadowing or diminishing, I guess, the potential for the use of Tetun. Credit as well, shout out to the Timor-Leste Studies Association of Australia that has made sure that there is papers presented in Tetun, I think since the first conference in 2009. And that it publishes its conference proceedings in Tetun, as well as the other 3 official and working languages. So just briefly, I'm happy to talk more about the research that produced the data that I'm going to discuss in this presentation, and that appears in my paper in the question and answer or discussion period. But I really just want to go briefly through where the data came from. So it was a part of my PhD, which was from 2013 and 2019, but the data collection period was over 3 years, including several extended visits from 2014 to 2017. And it involved lecturers as participants, and lecturers specifically from the fields of agriculture, petroleum studies, tourism, and community development studies. This was deliberate because the first 3, agriculture, petroleum studies, and tourism, have been identified in the National Strategic Plan as key strategic industries for Timor. So I was interested for the strategic development, sorry, I should say, of Timor-Leste. So I was interested particularly in those fields that are seen as the fields, the industries that are going to develop Timor, and what lecturers think about the language and communication that is needed to get students into those fields and into those industries and to get jobs in those industries, and indeed to develop the industries themselves and move the industries forward. I gathered data and interviewed lecturers from 4 tertiary campuses, 3 in the capital Dili and 1 in a district capital. And I don't think it's necessary, and also for the anonymity of the lecturers, I'm not going to name the institutions. And the data was gathered, it was a lot. I started with focus groups, and then from focus groups was able to identify key informants or people who had a lot to say, or people who perhaps had unique perspectives. And so out of those developed interviews, chose my interview participants, and I conducted observations of classrooms of teaching, but also of, I haven't got it here, but thesis presentations from students and supervisory communication between lecturers and students. And I should note here that when I'm talking about theses and supervision, this is for undergraduate study. So in Timor-Leste, and this relates to Alan's study in a way, because they've inherited this from Portugal, there's the Bacharelato involves an undergraduate thesis. So students are having to write an undergraduate thesis in their final year. In what language? That is the interesting question. And I'll come back to that. So what came out really strongly in my discussions with lecturers was this idea that Tetun itself presents a problem. It presents a challenge to communication at university, communication of knowledge, of disciplinary and professional knowledge at the tertiary level. And this is one example. It's a particularly strong one, but it was quite a typical comment. And you can see this petroleum engineering lecturer saying, we have a language problem. Ite problem lingua. And this automatically, he says, has implications for writing and theory, the problems with writing the thesis. And he says the problem is with the Tetun language. The Tetun language has difficulties with the technical language. For technical language, we can't write in Tetun because it is still lacking, right? So the way he's framing the problem here is that Tetun itself is the problem and its deficiency is the problem. And you can see that last comment there is really significant. Whether we want to or not, we are still writing using Indonesian. So the suggestion there is that the agency is removed. They have no choice. Lecturers have no choice but to use Indonesian. As Marilyn said in her introduction, Indonesian is mentioned because, particularly because many lecturers, particularly from private institutions, and this lecturer is from a private institution, have completed their undergraduate training and in some cases masters, and in far fewer cases PhDs in Indonesia. So Indonesia, and for English education, it would be the Philippines for private institutions, very rarely Australia, but the national university is the one that mainly gets the foreign funding for scholarships for students to go to, for lecturers to complete their graduate studies to go to Portugal or to Australia. So we have many private institutions that can't afford to send their lecturers for master's or PhD study to Australia or Portugal. And so many of them go to Indonesia, where they're studying in Indonesian. And so they are developing their knowledge and their own academic language and their own ability to communicate their knowledge, their academic knowledge and disciplinary knowledge in Indonesian, in and through Indonesian. But you can see here what this lecturer is doing is saying, well, the problem is Tetun, because it is lacking, it is the problem. And you can see the, sorry, I just noticed I had some chat, but I can't figure out how to get the chat. So I'm just going to ignore that. You can see here, this is an expanded shot of the same picture from my title page. And you can see here even more of the Indonesian coming into the commentary on these students' essays. It's about geology, but that's about geology for mining for land oil or for petroleum in Timor. And you can see on both of them, actually, they're saying, where's your kesimpulan? Kesimpulan, for those who don't know, in Indonesian means conclusion. Kesimpulan laiha. So there's definitely that code switching or mixing happening, referensi, but the feedback is still in Tetun, but using primarily Indonesian for words. And they're words that there are words for in Tetun, particularly with Portuguese loans as established loans, but these lecturers are using Indonesian, likely because it's how they've gotten feedback themselves. Then we have some lecturers that do acknowledge that perhaps their own repertoire is involved, and their own limitations with Tetun are involved with their ability to communicate knowledge in Tetun. And this lecturer from a different institution, an organic chemistry lecturer in agriculture, says, I myself also with Tetun, sometimes I can't, and then she says, apa ya? What is it? So she lapses into Indonesian there. Explica ho Tetun nebe lolos halo nusa. Explain with Tetun in the way it should be. So sometimes I look for the words, and again, she uses Indonesian kata-kata for words. She doesn't say liafuan, and I don't know them. So we do direct prax. langsung praktek. Again, she uses Indonesian, so they can understand. Then words like in sediment, mengendap, I don't know how to say it. Now, I should acknowledge as well that this lecturer is actually from Indonesia. So you're also seeing that Indonesian lecturers, higher education lecturers, are coming to get work in Timor in some cases. So certainly her, all of her schooling, as well as her undergraduate and I think master's training, was all in Indonesia and in Indonesian. So, but she acknowledges that, and she says that she doesn't know how to use the word, she doesn't know the word for sediment, for example. Now, sediment, I think it's helpful to go into this specific example here and look at the complexities involved in finding a word in Tetun, and try to bring out here as well to show you some of how the history of corpus planning, so the formal language planning that has been done for the Tetun language, how that presents certain challenges for people wanting to use the language for academic and intellectual purposes. So for the word sediment, for instance, we have this Hull dictionary from 1999 for Tetun English, and the Hull translates, which, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but my understanding is that Hull in this and the subsequent English Tetun dictionary, both of those were in cooperation with the INL, the Institución Nacional Lingüística. So, but there's contradiction. So in the 1999 dictionary, sedimentu is given in Tetun to mean sediment. And then in his 2006 English Tetun, in the other direction dictionary, lihunten, so I guess you could say a Tetun word derived more from Tetun Terik, but lihunten literally means dam or tank waste. But that word is given as the translation of sediment, if you look up sediment in the 2006 Hull dictionary. Now, in the Guterres Correa dictionary in 2005 from INL, neither sedimentu nor lihunten appear, and I couldn't find any translation, any Tetun word for sediment there. And as many of you will know, this dictionary is extremely hard to get a hold of, hard copies. So it's unlikely that this lecturer would have had this dictionary, even if it did have a translation for sediment. So you can see that there are struggles certainly for lecturers to find the right word, partly because of their repertoire and partly because there is a lack of settlement in the corpus planning that has been done, the formal language planning that has been done for the Tetun language. Having said that though, it is important to recognize, and what I want to focus on in this talk, and as I do in my paper, is the roles that lecturers are playing in intellectualizing Tetun. So to set the scene, I just want to refer to a previous publication where I talk about the roles that lecturers play as language planners. And so I say there that they are innovating constantly. They are doing so with particular ideological visions of the social relations that underpin their professional fields, innovating particularly in the use of Tetun to communicate knowledge. And I'll explain in a moment more what I mean by how they are innovating with these ideological visions of the social relations that underpin their professional fields. But hold that in your minds as we move forward. The problem though is that although they are doing this innovation, although lecturers' multilingual translations of disciplinary terms may be generating important innovations, they are also highlighting discrepancies between the plurilingual repertoires and the language ideologies, the beliefs and attitudes of different disciplinary and language experts. And the reason I wanted to refer to this publication is because it has this beautiful example of the word moris. So one agronomy or plant science lecturer that I spoke with gave me, told me that when he teaches his students about plant growth, he uses the Tetun word moris, which many of you will know as the word for life, or also born if it's used as a verb. But he says Moris is also understood, particularly by farmers in rural areas, as a process. It's sort of loosely translated as well-being. And he says it is like, you know, changing over. This is original English, by the way. I think the word crescimento, which would be the Portuguese loan, tetonized Portuguese word for growth, he says, I think it's mostly applied in economic terms, right? So he's distinguishing here between one word, Moris, he says, that farmers use to talk about growth in terms of their plants, and crescimento word for growth, which he's recognizing is used in Teton, but he's saying, well, that's more economic growth. Interesting. He says,
5 minutes.
The people in the village, sorry, yes?
5 minutes.
Okay, I better hurry up. They can only tell you, oh, this is good growth. Moris diac. They only refer to Moris diac. They don't know what is crecimiento. So you see here that this lecturer is positioning himself as knowledgeable, not just about what is the correct Teton word to use, but also who is using what particular groups in his field, so farmers in rural areas, how are they using Teton? And he is also teaching his students that they should use Moris because his students, many of his students, he imagines, will become agricultural extension workers. So he is thinking, well, I need to teach these students to go and communicate with farmers, as this picture shows an agricultural extension worker communicating with farmers about plants. So he's thinking about the communication, the social relations that are going to be relevant for his industry, for his profession, and what that means for his teaching. And he says, well, they should know, they should start practicing using Moris. And indeed, in his PowerPoint slides, so this is one of his PowerPoint slides from a presentation that he gave on crop water requirements to his students. And you can see he's used Moris for growth, right? In terms of aihoris, in terms of these various crops. Now, by contrast, another lecturer at the same institution in the same faculty, I asked him, because he is actually the agricultural extension lecturer, so I asked him, so what do you think about the use of Moris to mean growth? And he said very categorically, Moris doesn't mean this. Aumenta, this increase, doesn't mean Moris. This is different. You can't use this. These words crece or crecimiento or crece and Moris, these are real Teton, ne termud tetunduni. I said, yes, but the farmers, do they understand it? Yes, they understand. And then another lecturer that was there in this conversation said, but what if they don't? Notice that she's using Indonesian there as well, tapi, selai. And he says, well, if they don't understand, then they don't understand Teton, right? So the different positioning here, he is an expert of Teton. This is what Teton is. And if the farmers don't understand, then it's because they are not experts in Teton like they should be. Whereas the other lecturer has the position that, well, that is the Teton they use. So we need to learn their Teton if we want to communicate with them, right? As agricultural extension workers. Now, in this paper that's appearing in a special issue, I talk about this, and I could almost do 20 minutes presentation just on this wonderful exchange by this same lecturer who said that farmers don't speak Teton or don't understand Teton if they don't understand crecimiento. He's talking about reprodução, but in this one, he is contradicting one of his colleagues who's saying that reproduction or reprodução, the word reproduction doesn't exist in Teton, right? So this other lecturer, a third lecturer at the same institution, agricultural lecturer, is saying Teton doesn't have reproduction, telling me why Teton is a problem to communicate with. And another lecturer agrees, and then this lecturer goes on to say, well, you know, we have it in English, reproduction, Indonesian, reproduksi, and then this agricultural extension lecturer says, well, reprodução in Teton is reprodução. And then the first lecturer, Professor C, says, but it doesn't have a word truly its own. Yes, it does. In Teton, it's reprodução. But that's just changing a letter. No, it's not. And then the rest of them are all laughing. But you can see that there's conflict here in the same institution between lecturers in the same department actually about whether or not a word belongs to Tetun. And it's, I mean, I think it's kind of ironic because all of these words, you know, all of these words are arguably loaned, right? There's no reproduction, reprodução, reproduxi, you know, etymologically, you could source back to Latin. So at what point can we say that a word belongs to Tetun? And there is difference of opinion here in lecturers. And remember that lecturers are educating students who are going to become professionals and who are going to be highly educated in an elite minority in Timor still. There's a minority of graduates. And so they become authorities of language, particularly for language that is specific to their field. So the lexicon of their field in agriculture. Now, I know I've only got a few minutes left, but I really want to talk about a sort of a slightly contrasting view by a community development studies lecturer who says, well, look, it actually doesn't matter so much what words we use. What is important is the process of bringing Tetun into the classroom by inviting students to dialogically participate in the lesson and use the Tetun that the students are producing to help them to internalize the concept, as you can see there from this quote. He says, I can internalize the concept to them based on what they describe. And he gave me this really beautiful example of how he teaches Paulo Freire's 3 forms of consciousness, critical consciousness, magical consciousness, and naive consciousness. And so he says, without giving you the whole dialogue, what he says, I'm going to summarize it. And he's telling me how he teaches these 3 forms of consciousness, Paulo Freire's consciousness. And he says, first he starts by asking students, why is someone poor? And he said, then he gets students, he elicits from students their answers about all the possible reasons that someone might say why someone is poor. And they might say, Marumak castigo, so it's God is punishing them. La halo ceremonia umalulik, they're not doing the ceremonies at the umalulik, or la lori aifunan barate, they're not bringing flowers to the grave. And then he classifies these and he says, well, these are consciencia mágica, right? This is magical consciousness. Others might be they are just drinking all day, or they're lazy, or they're whatever, they're stupid. And he says, well, this is naive thinking, naive consciousness. And then critical consciousness would be lahetan hakbit, right? They haven't had empowerment. They haven't had an opportunity to get work. Or laya lian, they don't have voice, right? So using the Tetun provided by students, right, and putting it up, writing it on, so there's modality transfer happening there from the oral spoken Tetun to written Tetun, contradicting what that petroleum engineering lecturer had to say about Tetun not being possible to use for writing. Putting it up on the board and then strategically with the pedagogy there, classifying it in order to teach the concepts. You can see there that's a really nice, clear way to not just have Tetun in the classroom, but to use students, to validate students' Tetun, and then to make more sense of it and to participate in the knowledge construction by introducing these other terms. Incidentally, I'm not sure why he doesn't use Hanoian instead of consciencia, but anyway, I think that's really not the point. Okay, so just to finish up here, as I said, there are multiple roles being played by lecturers. So there is a discourse planning role being played so that they are framing the problem, and as disciplinary experts, as very well-respected elite group in Timor-Leste, what they say about Tetun and whether it can or can't be used as a language of academic and scientific communication matters. So what they say about it is framing the discourse, it's framing the problem. They're also doing performative language planning by constantly modeling and monitoring correct, according to them, performances of disciplinary and professional communication in marking students' papers, as I saw right at the beginning, putting up on the board, providing PowerPoint slides, interacting with students in the classroom, etc. So they are doing this translation of expert discipline-specific knowledge into Tetum, mixed with other more established academic languages. And in doing so, they are innovating and extending the reach of Tetum constantly, and sometimes in conflicting ways. And sometimes conflicting not just with one another, but also with more formal, established language planning that has occurred. And so I can talk more about that in the discussion session if needed, if there's time. Just for recommendations very quickly, because I think it's good to be as practical as possible as well with this, what is needed. Look, lecturers need support. They are doing so much in Timor. The way that it is set up, for some reason, that lecturers, on top of having to do their teaching and their own research if they get time, they have to do supervision, as I said, of undergraduate theses, one-on-one supervision often, and there's a lot involved in helping students to write a thesis in Tetum or Indonesian in some cases, or Portuguese if they're able to do that. They're also, on top of that, having to do admin because they don't get admin support. So there needs to be faculty level as well as institution level and ideally national level support for lecturers and academics in developing teaching and learning resources in Tetum. If we have time in discussion, I have a story about where that hasn't happened and it needed to happen. There also needs to be more facilitated and supported dialogue and collaboration between content or disciplinary experts and language experts. So those, not just in the INL, but language teachers, Tetum teachers in the different institutions, they need to be talking to the teachers of the different faculties and saying, what do your students need to know? And then let's talk about how we can, what Tetum is needed to develop that, to facilitate that knowledge. In terms of the process of intellectualizing Tetum more broadly, there needs to be funding and support for publishing houses and academic journals in Tetum. I want to acknowledge here that UNTL, the National University, already is publishing 2 or 3 journals in Tetum, which is excellent. This needs to be promoted and supported more, not just at the institutional level, but nationally, and there needs to be other independent that as well. Lastly, and I'll finish with this, there needs to be a shift in thinking from can Tetum do the work, right? This focus on what the language can and can't do, of communicating abstract academic and scientific knowledge, to can we, and I mean all of us involved in Timor, can we commit ourselves to the use of Tetum for communicating knowledge in diverse contexts and with diverse audiences? We need to think about this question. Thank you very much. Obrigado, Barak.
Okay, thank you. And basically, according to the times given to us, we are run out of time because it's 9:40. But I hope that there's a time for us to have some questions and comments from some of the colleagues there. It's supposed to be, there is somewhere, give a sign that there's a raise a hand to want to ask a question. So but I can't find it. So, but anyway, if anyone want to comment or ask a question. Okay, if not, Marlene want to have some comment. Can you give it a very brief, Marlene?
Thank you all for a most interesting and very coherent session. All the papers go so well together. Thank you so much. Beautiful, very well prepared presentations. And I learned even more through this discussion. I wish we could have had it 6 months ago. One thing that one point I'd like to make is that my response to one of the things that you said, Trent, is that when I was talking about
the internationalization of higher education as part of the global conditions and the diversifying pathways of university lecturers, of course, that also means not just outward movement, but inward movement. So as you mentioned, there's the Indonesian lecturer. I heard once about a Senegalese who's somehow involved in teaching. So there are folk who are moving in with different language resources into the university system as well. Not only, of course, individuals, but also through cooperation programs of the sort that Alain mentioned. So yes, it's a two-way street in that regard. And the other thing I would like to pick up on is, to extend our discussion in a way, is what Alain said in response to what he said about how through the teacher education program, the teachers are encountering all sorts of ideas about how you do pedagogy and sort of ideologies of pedagogy, if you like, and ways of organizing language teaching, which are rather specific to particular traditions in different national contexts, Brazil, Portugal, and so on. So in addition to drawing on their own language resources in skillful ways, teachers in, say, primary education are also drawing on ideas from their own teacher education experience as well in important ways. So that's kind of interesting, which of course you don't have in the higher education context. They're not trained, of course, to teach in higher education. So that's sort of an interesting additional thing that occurred to me as you were talking. So thank you for those. Lots of other points I'd like to raise, but a really coherent and very interesting panel. So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Marlene. More comments or any questions from colleagues for any of the three presenters?
Does anybody want to add? Oh, yeah, the question.
I was just going to say that Trent's presentation touched a bit of a nerve with me, as I'm used to be the Timor and the Indonesian librarian at the National Library, and I've been collecting material from East Timor for years. And what I get told, always used to hear over and over and over and over, we can't use Tetum because it's not developed. We have to use Portuguese. And I think the answer then is develop Tetum. That's the, and Indonesian is used because it's a developed language, but Indonesian was sneered at, you know, when Indonesia began its independence, people saying you can't use Bahasa Malay, you can't use Indonesian, it's a market language, it's not developed. And yet they put the effort into it. They had the Balai Pustaka Publishing Company. That it can be done. It just doesn't seem that there's the will there. It infuriates me because people want to use Tetum. It's theirs. It's their language. It's their culture. It needs that nurturing and support. So it's very interesting panels. Thank you very much for that. It's more of comment than I don't have questions. It's just a comment.
Very helpful, Anya. Thanks for it. More comments, questions from anyone? Just click on. Yeah, Daniel.
Thank you very much for all the talks. I really enjoyed. And what Anya just said, it comes from my heart as well. That what I've seen in adult literacy education, people have ideas about how education should be, but on the ground, there's so much interesting things going on that are completely different. So there's the talk about Portuguese and Tetum as pedagogical aid, but this is from a few years ago. But on the ground, they are using all the languages they have to get things done. And this is probably still going on. That there's the idea of how it should be, and there's the practical solutions that people find. And it's so important to look at those practical solutions on the ground, in the field. So yeah, thank you for showing this today.
Thank you. And yeah, is anybody else, Trent,
I just
come in?
very quickly on that. And then I want to acknowledge as well that the Centro Cultural, there's some students that want to ask a question there. But just very quickly, I want to, in response to both Danielle and Anya, I think the point that needs to be really emphasized and we need to remember is that Tetun already is being developed because people are using it all the time, as Danielle was saying, to get work done. And it is being used to do communicate quite sophisticated concepts, not just in universities, but particularly in development, in conversations happening between international development agencies and local communities and agencies at the national level as well, in talking about concepts like, you know, how to get rid of poverty. This word hakbit, empowerment, is getting used more and more instead of a Portuguese loan, right? So we need to pay attention to how Tetun is already intellectualized. It's because it's already doing a lot of work. That's all. And then students wanted to ask a question.
So, all right, I'm from Timor. I am a student from UNT. So I have a question for
Trent.
Yeah, with
Trent, it's for you. The
for
question.
you, yeah, because I have been listen about your presentation about some words that as a student we feel it is right now as a problem that we as a student face. For instance, like tugas, as you explained before. That's a very complicated for us because the origin of the Tetun is enough or not have. So we just use the Portuguese language and then Indonesian language. How can we increase it or change it as our origin language? I think so.
Thank you so much for the question. So just to clarify, you're asking what can be done to extend the reach of Tetun. Well, I think, for example, with the word tugas, and I don't know quite how we can do this, but we need to somehow move beyond an insecurity or a concern with using Indonesian loan words, particularly in higher education, because there is already such an extensive use of Indonesian. And yet there's an aversion to recognizing, people don't want to recognize that Indonesian words are used in universities in Timor, particularly at UNTL, I think, where there's an extra pressure to use Portuguese. So recognizing that loan words are already being used and have now become Tetun words, really, because they're doing that work in Tetun, like we saw with reprodução, right? That's a Tetun word, why not? So recognizing that there are resources there that are already being used in Tetun, and so changing people's attitudes, I think there's a lot, and this was across all three of the presentations. It's really there, and the ideologies that are against the Tetun being used or Tetun being developed enough, that's what we need to fight against. I'm interested to hear what Ilgrada or Alan have to say.
Yeah, first is reprodução. We just adopt the Portuguese language. We take some pronunciation of the Portuguese language. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you. Any further comment, or Alan or Ilde want to add to this? No.
I would like to make an addition, Esteban. I think that, you know, so thinking about Bakhtin and about the issue of centripetal and centrifugal forces in language processes, I think Tetun is a strong centripetal force, but I think that we have to be careful to not reinforce monoglot ideologies in Timor-Leste. Because I think something that's really important is that people who are in the elite in Timor-Leste do not speak one language. They speak 4, 5, 6, 8 languages, and very well. So speaking different languages is the path to be successful and Timor-Leste. So as many languages as you speak, as more successful as you can be. And so also dealing with these different resources is very important. So when I was supervising students in Untitled, usually we would work with Tetum to talk and to the guidance, but reading and writing would be done in Portuguese because they were students of the course for students from the course of like pedagogy for kids. So this was a way of dealing with that. And also people like in university, I know from other courses that were also dealing with this kind of issue. Sometimes like working with Indonesian, working with Tetum, so working with English, working with Tetum. So we have also to value these different uses of different languages. So I was thinking about like Katarina that was in the Institute of Technology, thinking about these specific dictionaries, but also thinking about like how can you work in a multilingual way in higher education. So I think that it's very important to give weight to Tetum, but it's also important to have this multilingual horizon in these discussions, I think. So yeah.
Thank you. Any further comments?
Can I just add as well, following up with
Yes.
what Alan was saying about multilingual resources. So I think from the work that I conducted in Timor, so it's still at primary level. And I think there's an expectation in year 6 that lessons should be run in Portuguese only. But I think what is happening, and not just in primary school level, or as in the work shown by Trent, even in university level, there is the use of bilingual practice like code switching or translanguaging, whatever we want to call it. And these are practices that already exist in Timorese everyday life. So, so I think we also have to do discussion, following up what Alan was saying. How do we do that? So it's a bilingual, multilingual language policy. Timorese people are already using different language in their everyday life. So can we bring that to the classroom to teach, to do Mayo, to teach agriculture, to teach, and how do we do it? Instead of people feeling bad, that teachers feeling bad that they can't do everything in Tetum, they can't do everything in Portuguese. So I'm going to bring bits of Indonesian, and it should be okay. I don't know. So I think there's also something that should be put in discussion. Is it all right for teachers to bring all these different resources, and can we train them to do that? And how do we train them?
Just to add on to that. So
Yeah.
Just very quickly to add on to that, Ligala, I think at the university level, what we have is we still have a separation of language support programs. So you have a separate semester of Portuguese, a separate semester of English, and a separate semester of Tetum, and no Indonesian for academic purposes taught at all. And what is needed, I think, is a class where students can actually look at what does mixing mean in this context, or translanguaging or code switching with this audience. If we use this Indonesian word, how does that affect the communication? How does that affect the relationship? How does that affect the knowledge that is being transferred or communicated? If we use a Portuguese word instead, what effect does it have? If we use an English word, what effect does it have? So that analysis of how multilingual communication has certain effects on knowledge transfer and on relationships, that needs to be taught rather than, well, not rather than, but at least in addition to this siloed, separated, parallel monolingual approach to language support. And then students like the student at the Centro Cultural who asks about, well, what do we do? Is it appropriate to use tugas, reprodução? Does it matter if we have a different pronunciation to Brazilian or Portuguese pronunciation? Those questions, that conversation can happen. It needs to happen, but there's no space for it to happen currently amongst teachers or amongst students.
Yes, absolutely. more language awareness is needed. I love the example of your university lecturer who used a sort of Paulo Freire method of pedagogy. So that kind of pedagogy should be widely encouraged, and just to raise awareness of the indexicality, the small scale indexicality of some of the choices that people make. If you highlight the Portuguese-ness of your tetum or the Indonesian-ness of your tetum, yeah, all those things up for debate, I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think there's no more questions or comments. I think we should wrap up because we have gone beyond our slotted time. But if you still, you know, if the organizers don't mind and are not happy, then we should stay on to talk about more. And I hope that
it's
no,
okay.
it's okay. Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Yes, Marisha.
It's okay. Jeez.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So our group is still open. So more comments and questions, and Marlene want to say something.
Okay, this is more informal, and I'd just like to talk to the people who are contributing to the special issue. As you know, at long last, all the papers have gone into the journal language policy. We're just waiting for the final go-ahead on the afterword. We have 4 papers, the 3 papers that have been presented here, our introduction, one written by Stefan and me, and also there's the paper by our colleagues in Tilburg University on adult literacy and the local conditions for adult literacy programs. And in addition, we have this afterword by Feliciano Chimbutani from Universidade Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. And we're just waiting for his paper to go through this very clunky editorial management system of the journal. So hopefully, if all goes well, the whole special issue will come out next year. I anticipate about the middle of next year. So watch out for the proofs when they come your way. And particularly, I think in the case of Trent, because of the problem around anonymization and the misunderstandings for the editorial management system. Yeah, any questions about the special issue? Oh, somebody, yeah.
Carlos. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a different question. It's about languages in school system. Some years ago, there was a launching of an experience of using mother languages in 3 districts for the first level of primary schools. And I don't know if this experience is going on and what is the balance that the state policies are doing about that. It was as if I remember well, there was 3 districts in with Fataluku,
Baikeno, and Galone. And Galone.
What is the how does it been improving, and what is the result of that?
Okay, there is in this regard, there has been some debates in Timor itself, I think, and that politically there is very divided on this issue, and also with the changing of government, because perhaps I should say that the mother tongue issue was the policy of the previous government. IMP but not the last AMP. The first AMP is Aliança Maioria Parlamentar, which they start on from, I think, 2012 onwards, and it is still going on. And now we have some change in the government. The Minister of Education now is from Fred Ling, and Fred Ling is definitely against the mother tongue issue. So at the moment, it's still in negotiation, still going. As far as its success or not, I'm not sure because we have not heard very much about it. But one thing is very sure is that if that school that 3 examples continues, they will be very successful because they will provide a lot of material, education material on that, and very specific in a small classroom. So it is difficult to, from my point of view, it will be difficult to compare with other public schools because there will be not enough materials in order to compete with each other. But I think Alain wants to say something about that. Because Alain went to one of those schools.
Yeah. So no, yeah. They did a report on the results. So it was published last year. So when I went to UK to the conference, they had just published. So, and it was really interesting, the results. So it's very similar between the CAFE, the schools of reference, the Portuguese language schools of reference, and the mother tongue schools in terms of results in the tests that they did. So the children had similar results. So this points out for exactly what Esteban is saying about a main problem in the schools of Timor are the resources. So resources for teachers, books and materials and everything. So if you have like all these conditions, these material conditions in the schools, probably you can be successful in the way you are teaching. So if the teachers having people following them, supervising and guiding their work, so you can be successful with different kinds of strategies. So I suppose because also I think this is a problem with there's a problem with the way the school system of Timor was planned, because it was planned based on the Portuguese model, where you have like one model for all the country. So in all the schools of the country, you have the same model of teaching. So in Timor, they tried to think about this kind of school, and usually, for example, here in Brazil, we have different types of schools. So for if you are in a rural area, so the calendar of the schools is suited to the periods of agriculture. So if you are in an indigenous area where people have traditions, specific traditions, this school is also suited to that. So I think probably the answer in relation to that is in the middle. So it would be necessary to think where, because then, sometimes, for example, the report was doing a very strong argument for mother tongue based teaching in all the schools of Timor. And I think this is not the answer. So probably it's not for all the schools, but probably maybe for some schools would be interesting. So I think this is something that the Timorese have to discuss, how to balance the different needs of different kids in different areas of the country. So I think this is something that should be more deeply discussed.
Okay, Marlene?
Yes. Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Daniel, come in.
Yeah, just to add what Carlos was saying about mother tongue use in education in primary school, and also Ellen, maybe it's good to mention that this use of mother tongue in resources was also happening in an informal way in adult literacy education. So there was no official project, but there were materials being made, Tetum and local language. And the students, the adult learners in those groups were very, very enthusiastic about it, because especially when you're learning to read and write and you can see something in your own language, it made them so enthusiastic about the whole process. So I think it was informal. I've seen materials made by people supported by GFFTL, supported by Oxfam years ago. I think it's very important to know that even if it's not an official project, it is going on because people need it. But yeah, it should come from the people who are learning and who are teaching, that they decide what is needed indeed. So I agree with Alan about that.
And you were also involved in some of in the preparation of those materials as well. Then yeah. Marilyn wants to say something.
Another perspective here is that we talked in the introduction about the global conditions. One of the global conditions is, of course, the increasing role and power of international organizations in development and in the global south in particular. And it's important to note that when the idea of mother tongue based multilingual education came to Timor, it was the first time, I forget the exact date, but it was around 2011, when people started using the term mother tongue. The discourse about mother tongue comes, of course, from the 1953 UNESCO document about the use of mother tongues. And UNESCO, despite its incredible influence around the world, its discourses have not really changed, not in step with current thinking about language. And moreover, the launch of that pilot project began with the UNESCO conference, which was I think, organized by CARE International. So again, international NGOs are also quite involved. And another thing to note is that now the program runs with support from Summer Institute for Linguistics, which is based as the evangelical organization in the United States. So there are these international dimensions that have brought this debate into play. And not only that, but the method that is proposed is called Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education, MTB-MLE. This is spreading across Southeast Asia and the Philippines and elsewhere, again, with UNESCO support. But it is one of those bilingual education or multilingual education programs, which, as Trent mentioned earlier, there's this incredible separation behind the model, so that you start with one language and then you move to the other in a sort of rather unnatural way, because as several people have said, Timorese spontaneously move in and out of the different linguistic resources they have in their ordinary life. And this notion of separation is a very sort of Eurocentric idea of what language is. So there's this dimension is important as well, that of the source of the idea of mother tongue based education. Having said that, I think there should be space for local languages to be used, definitely, where it's appropriate in whatever sector of education, but not as a sort of top-down separation model of bilingual education.
Okay. Anyone want to say more things or comments?
Lucy wants us to come to an end.
Lucy, I think as if you want to. Yeah, I think if.
Sorry, I'm with a mobile phone seeing your, because I can see it from a mobile phone also. So I'm sorry, I just put the finger, but it's great. Okay. And don't worry with time, because we have a little time. So be at ease.
Okay, thank you. And more comments and more ideas or questions. But if not, I think we should wrap it up. I think. Yeah.
been really, really nice to see you all and to have this conversation. As I said, we should have had it at least 6 months ago. Yes, and just good luck to you all in your quite challenging lockdown conditions.
Yeah.
Especially Alain over there in Sao Paulo.
Okay. Chris, you want to say something?
Just ask what, with the recordings of these sessions and indeed other sessions, how are they being distributed to participants or disseminated to participants, if at all?
I think it's Lucy can answer that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Trent, for that question. Yes, we will put all the records available in due time, but it is going to take us more than we expected. We have sessions with more than 6 hours to edit. So in the next couple of weeks, they will be available and we will send an email. Oh, sorry, because I'm with two sounds. Okay, because I see also from the mobile phone to check out that this is working also. So you will receive a warning. And I also take the opportunity to say that you can also, during the next week, you can also continue the discussion or put or share data as you wish in the forums. Rui Feijó will talk about this in the last session, but really we will have this platform open, and it will be open when we will say that the videos are available, okay? So that you can come and you can enter. They will be for now in limited access, but as far as we have seen so far, no one has objected because we have sent a declaration from the Congress stating our data information management, you know, we are obliged to. But if no one until the end of the Congress says anything again, we can share it also publicly in due time. Afterwards, we will put it also. It will be in YouTube access, but only through the platform. But if no one objects, then they will become free and available, okay, for everyone, so that they can share see your work and share and have opportunity to use it in classes, etc., whatever. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And I hope that it has been clarified about any that. And if there is further question related to this, then it should address to the organizers. Am I right? So
sorry.
I said if any further questions related to the publication or they should address to you.
Yes, as for the Rui Feijó will also talk about it. As for our proceedings, yes, it is a shorter paper than the ones you are working. I saw that you are working in a number. It's great. It's a great output to us all. But for the proceedings, yes, it is a shorter paper with 3,000 words only, plus bibliography. Okay, so but if you can participate also in it, it would be great to have here. Even if the shorter version.
We've all sent our communication papers in. We've sent them all in. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't saw it all. Thank you very much. But if you want, yes. As for the forum, please, I will ask Marilyn and Stefan to, if they can, in the next weeks, they also can access, so to see if there is any kind of question for someone. Because if the papers are there, someone can go and read it now in the weekend, and maybe next week they come up with a question. Because this Congress has a two-dimension, you know, it's direct here, but it's also asynchronous in the sense that someone can read it and come afterwards with a question. So please just check out. If you come during next week, you just come here and see if there is any question. And all of you can come in and see.
And Trent wants to say something, Trent?
It's actually just on the forum. So I think that would be a good place maybe for us to upload our PowerPoints, especially because I saw in the chat that many of you couldn't do my PowerPoint slides and the data that I was presenting, which is a shame. So do we upload that? Do we have capacity to upload that to the forum ourselves, or do we send them to?
No, you can.
Marilyn and Esteban.
You can upload directly your PowerPoints there. It is up to 500 megabytes. So if they are under this, it is okay. But
Okay.
I think probably they are. Also, if you don't want to write, you can left a message with a video. The forum has incorporated a small camera so that you can send a short message and say to colleagues, hello, I'm just leaving here my PowerPoint. No need to write, just let the message, you know, or just a voice recorder also, so you can let your voice just there saying that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Daniel, yes.
Just maybe good to say to Trent that it was not, we could read most of your slides, but some of them took a lot of time to build up, and then we couldn't read the letters because they were still unclear.
Yeah, yeah, and it was, I also noticed here, but you know, I'm illiterate in the technology, so I cannot solve that.
Can I also say a very big thank you to the Open University of Portugal for its incredible support and highly efficient system for making this conference happen. So I think Lucio, you're with the Universidade Aberta. Thank you very much.
So once again, I would like to close up by saying thank you very much. And I'm sure that the debate about developing Teton will go on until maybe one day. I hope that in very short time, we will have an academic Teton language in Timor. Thank you very much for all. That's it. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you all. Oh, join us. Join us in the last session with Luis Cardoso if you can, okay?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
See you.
See you.